Welcome to Backbone Unlimited. My name is Matt Hartsky. In this episode, we're going to talk about one of the most frustrating situations elk hunters face in the mountains when the wind swirls all day. You plan your approach based on thermals. You check the forecast. You think you understand what the wind should be doing in your area, but once you get into the terrain, everything starts behaving differently. The wind shifts directions. It drops into pockets of timber. It bounces off of ridges, and suddenly every setup feels risky. If you're not familiar with who I am, I've been hunting and guiding Western big game for over 34 years, and I've been a professional strength conditioning and nutrition coach for more than 30 years, and I'm here to help you become a more consistent and successful hunter and outdoorsman. A lot of hunters assume that when the wind gets unpredictable, the hunt is basically over. It can be super frustrating. They either force bad setups or they completely shut down for the day. But after more than 3 decades of hunting Western elk, I can tell you that swirling wind doesn't necessarily mean you can't hunt. It simply means you need to hunt differently. In this episode, I'm going to break down how to position yourself, adjust your strategy, and continue hunting effectively even when the wind refuses to cooperate. More elk encounters are ruined by swirling wind probably than most any other factor in the mountains. Most hunters focus on visibility, distance, or calling tactics, but mature elk rely on their nose far more than their eyes. When wind becomes unstable, every movement you make is going to carry risk. The problem with swirling wind is that it destroys predictability. When wind is steady, even if it isn't perfect, you can still make strategic decisions. You can approach from downwind, set up with thermals in your favor, and control the direction your scent travels. But when winds start shifting, dropping, and bouncing through the terrain, those calculations fall apart. Suddenly, your scent isn't moving in one direction anymore. It's drifting into pockets of timber, rolling across benches, and spilling into the exact places elk are standing. And this is why so many elk encounters end the same way. The bull answers calls, he starts moving in closer, then everything goes quiet. A moment later, the elk might explode out of the cover because your scent finally reached him before you saw him. The key lesson here is that swirling wind doesn't just make hunting harder, it changes how you have to hunt. Instead of forcing aggressive setups, successful hunters are going to learn how to position themselves and adapt their strategy to minimize the damage swirling wind can cause. To understand how to hunt the wind swirls, you first have to understand what swirling wind actually is. In mountain country, there are three main forces affecting air movement. You've got your prevailing wind, you've got thermals, and you have terrain-driven turbulence. Prevailing wind is the larger weather pattern, right? This is the general wind direction you see in forecasts. It might be a west wind, a north wind, or whatever the wind weather system is pushing across the landscape. In flat country, that wind often stays pretty relatively consistent. Thermals are different. Thermals are caused by temperature changes. As the sun warms the ground during the morning and early afternoon, air begins to rise uphill. In the evening and overnight, cooling air sinks back down the hill. Those thermal patterns are one of the most important things elk hunters rely on when planning their approach. But swirling wind happens when those two forces collide with terrain, ridges, basins, cliff bands, terrain pockets, and steep elevation all changes how the air is redirected. When prevailing wind pushes across those features while thermals are also rising or falling, the air begins to tumble and rotate. Instead of moving in a clean direction, scent starts drifting unpredictably through the landscape. That's why swirling wind isn't just bad luck, it's usually a signal that terrain is breaking up the airflow and creating unstable conditions. Certain terrain features consistently create unstable air movement in elk country. When wind interacts with complex terrain, it rarely continues moving in a straight, predictable direction. Bowls and large basins are some of the worst places for swirling wind. Air drops into those depressions and begins circulating as it collides with the surrounding ridges. Instead of just flowing across the landscape, wind often tumbles and rotates inside the basin. Finger ridges can create similar problems. When prevailing wind crosses a series of small ridges or draws, it gets redirected over and over again. Each ridge pushes air in a slightly different direction, which creates turbulence and shifting scent currents. Benches and steep breaks along mountainsides also contribute to unstable airflow. Air flowing downhill might hit a bench and temporarily stall before spilling over the edge again. When that happens, scent can drift sideways or even back uphill for a short period. Cliff bands and rock faces add another layer of complexity by deflecting wind and forcing it upward or sideways. Dark timber pockets and creek bottoms often hold cooler air, especially during the morning and evening, and that cooler air can pull thermals downhill while the prevailing wind continues moving across the slope above it. When several of these terrain features exist in the same area, swirling wind becomes almost unavoidable. One of the most valuable skills in elk hunting is recognizing that unstable wind before you commit to a setup. A lot of hunters don't realize the wind is bad until the elk are already gone, and by that point, the damage is done. The first thing to do, like usual in elk and mule deer country, is to study the terrain. If you're standing in a bowl, basin, or steep pocket surrounded by multiple ridges, there's a good chance air is already circulating unpredictably. Those areas tend to trap and redirect wind rather than allowing it to move cleanly across the landscape. Sun exposure also plays a role. South facing slopes are going to warm faster and create those rising thermals earlier in the day. North facing slopes stay cooler and hold that falling air longer. When those two temperature zones meet along the same ridge system, thermals often collide and create unstable air. Vegetation can reveal subtle wind movement that your face might not feel. Watch grass tips, small branches, and drifting seeds. If they're moving in a different direction within a short distance, the wind is already swirling. Hey, if you hunt public land elk and you're tired of grinding through random seasons, I built the elk hunting series of ebooks for you. Most hunters don't struggle because they lack effort. They struggle because they lack a system. And that's exactly why I built the elk hunting ebook series as a complete progressive framework for Western elk hunters who are done guessing and ready to hunt with intention. Volume 1 is going to be Foundations in Reality. I reset your mindset and expose the assumptions that quietly wreck seasons. In Volume 2, Finding Elk and Understanding Pressure, you'll learn how elk actually move under pressure so you can anticipate instead of react. In Volume 3, Terrain, Wind, and Position, I break down how to use landscape and thermals to consistently create opportunities. In Volume 4, Calling, Silence, and Pressure, sound becomes a decision tool, not an impulse. In Volume 5, Bow Hunting Execution, we're talking about close range strategy so you can finish your encounters. And in Volume 6, Late Season and Post Rut, we're talking about how elk shift after the rut and how to adapt when others quit. This is a system built for consistency. This isn't theory, it's a structured system to help you find elk, read country, and make confident decisions every season. Buy each volume individually or bundle them all to save 50% off at backboneunlimited.com. Access routes matter too. If your approach forces your scent to drop into feeding areas or benches or timber pockets where elk could be traveling, you're already in trouble. The key is recognizing those warning signals early and adjusting your position before elk ever smell you. When the wind starts shifting in elk country, most hunters make the same mistake. They try to force the situation instead of adjusting to it. The moment you hear a bugle or see elk moving, it's really easy to become emotionally committed to that encounter. Instead of evaluating whether the wind is still workable, a lot of hunters push forward because they don't want to lose the opportunity. But unfortunately, that's exactly how most elk get blown out. One of the most common mistakes is continuing to call from a bad position. The bull answers. The wind starts drifting unpredictably, but the hunter keeps calling anyway, hoping the elk is going to commit or commit quickly. In reality, that bull is almost always circling or drifting through cover trying to get downwind. Another mistake is dropping into the wrong elevation band. When wind becomes unstable, a lot of hunters often move downhill into benches or timber pockets or creek bottoms where scent begins pooling and then swirling even worse. Chasing elk into unstable air is another trap. The more aggressively you push towards the animals, the more unpredictable your scent becomes. The biggest problem is emotional commitment. Hunters become locked into the moment instead of stepping back reassessing the wind, and repositioning before the situation completely falls apart. When the wind becomes unreliable, your positioning becomes far more important than aggression. Instead of pushing directly into elk, I start thinking about where I can hunt from positions that reduce the damage swirling wind can cause. One of the first adjustments I make is hunting the edges of terrain instead of the centers. Bowls, basins, and deep timber pockets often hold the worst air movement, like we talked about. So, by staying along the edges of those features, such as the outer edge of the rim or upper edge of the basin, I can often find a cleaner airflow and keep my scent out of where the elk are. I also avoid sitting directly on the exact line of elk travel. If your scent drifts across the main travel route, the encounter is over before it ever begins. Instead, I try to position slightly off that line so that minor wind shifts don't immediately blow into the animals. Side hills often provide a more stable wind than your bottoms or your ridge tops as well. A steady cross slope position can sometimes keep air moving consistently in one direction. Whenever possible, I also try to keep elk either above me or below me rather than directly level with my position, and that vertical separation helps reduce the chance of scent drifting straight to them. And most importantly, I avoid terrain traps where wind tends to swirl uncontrollably. When the wind starts swirling, calling tactics need to become more conservative as well. The biggest mistake a lot of hunters make in unstable wind is continuing to run aggressive calling setups that require elk to approach close. The more you call, the longer you stay in one place, the greater chance a bull will eventually circle downwind and catch your scent. On days when the wind is inconsistent, I usually reduce how often I call. Instead of constantly challenging a bull, I might focus on occasional location bugles or soft cow sounds that keep the elk talking without forcing him into a tight encounter if I'm not ready. The goal becomes gathering information rather than pulling the bull directly into your lap before you're ready to predict that wind. Movement also needs to slow down. A lot of hunters respond to swirling wind by trying to constantly reposition, but that often just spreads your scent across more terrain. In unstable air, fewer movements usually creates fewer problems. Aggressive setups where you try to force a bull into bow range a lot of times become more riskier in that wind. If I know the wind is unreliable, I'm more likely to stay patient, keep some distance, and avoid letting the bull pinpoint my exact location. The goal on swirling days is pretty simple: keep the interaction alive without giving the elk a clear opportunity to wind you until you're ready to direct him to exactly where you want to go, where you know you've got high odds. When the wind becomes unpredictable, aggressive hunting tactics start working against you. This is the moment when a lot of experienced elk hunters shift from attacking the elk to intercepting them. Aggressive calling setups and direct stalks rely heavily on stable wind. So I hear guys say things like, you have to be aggressive, you have to call often and a lot. That's the only way to hunt elk. And I'm telling you, there should never be an always or never in elk hunting, right? You're asking the elk to close distance while trusting that your scent will stay contained long enough for the encounter to happen. When the wind's swirling, that margin for error disappears really quickly. Instead of forcing close encounters, I start focusing on where elk are likely to move naturally across the terrain. Elk travel through the mountains using predictable terrain features like benches, side hill travel, saddles, and transition zones between feeding and bedding areas. Rather than just chasing the animals directly, a lot of times I try to position myself along those natural movement corridors and wait for the elk to travel through. This approach reduces the amount of movement you need to make and limits how much scent you spread across the landscape. You're no longer trying to force the encounter to happen immediately. Instead, you allow elk to move through terrain that naturally funnels them towards your position. On days when the wind refuses to cooperate, patience and positioning often produce more opportunities than aggressive calling or stalking ever will. A lot of times, I don't know if you've noticed, but on windy days when it starts ramping up by like 9 o'clock, you're not going to hear very much elk talking. There's a reason for that. And so those guys that say just keep on calling and call aggressively, good luck when the wind's blowing, right? And swirling. Those aggressive tactics are not going to work because that's not what an elk would expect another elk to be doing. One of the hardest decisions in elk hunting is knowing when to stop pushing and simply walk away from the situation as well. When the wind becomes extremely unstable, continuing to hunt aggressively often does more harm than good. If your wind indicator is showing constant directional changes, drifting downhill one moment, uphill the next, you're likely standing in terrain where air movement is completely broken up. In those situations, every step you take spreads scent into new areas, and sooner or later, elk are going to cross one of those scent trails, and you don't want to push them out of your area. This is when discipline becomes important. Sometimes the smartest move is to back out and wait. Wind often stabilizes later in the day as thermals become more predictable in the evening. What feels impossible to hunt at midday can become much more manageable just a few hours later. Other times, the solution is changing terrain entirely. Moving to a different slope, a different elevation band, or more open side hills can dramatically improve the airflow. Even shifting a few hundred yards can move you out of a turbulent wind pocket. The key lesson is simple here. Not every encounter needs to be forced. No always and no never. Sometimes protecting the area and returning under better wind conditions gives you a far better chance of success. After more than 3 decades of elk hunting in the mountains, I've developed a few simple rules I follow every time the wind refuses to behave. Those rules don't eliminate the problem, but they dramatically reduce the number of encounters that get blown apart by unstable wind. The first rule is to respect the wind more than the excitement of the moment. When a bull answers a call or elk suddenly appear, it's easy to rush the situation, but mature elk survive because they trust their nose. If the wind is unstable, patience almost always beats aggression. The second rule is to hunt terrain that gives the wind fewer opportunities to swirl. Clean side hills, ridges with consistent airflow, and the edges of terrain features usually hold more predictable wind than bowls, basins, or deep timber pockets. My third rule is to avoid overcommitting to one encounter. If the wind begins shifting unpredictably, I'm willing to back out, reposition, or even leave the area entirely rather than risk educating the elk. And the final rule is simple. Let elk make the mistake. When wind conditions are difficult, disciplined positioning and patience often create opportunities that impatient and overly aggressive hunters never see. Swirling wind is one of the most frustrating challenges elk hunters face in mountain country, but it's also a reality you're going to encounter sooner or later. The key isn't expecting perfect wind conditions. The key is learning how to adapt when conditions aren't ideal. When the wind becomes unpredictable, the smartest hunters I know slow down. They stop forcing aggressive setups and they start focusing on positioning, terrain, and patience. Instead of charging toward elk and hoping everything works out, they look for cleaner airflow, safer angles, and natural travel routes where elk might move through on their own. Most blown elk encounters happen because hunters try to push through unstable wind instead of adjusting to it. Mature elk survive by trusting their nose, and in swirling conditions, that advantage becomes even stronger. But disciplined hunters can still create opportunities by respecting the wind, reading terrain carefully, and knowing when to move, when to wait, and when to let the mountains reset the situation. Now, if you want to go deeper into elk movement, pressure patterns, terrain positioning, and structured decision making, that's exactly why I built the elk hunting series of ebooks. It's a progressive system designed to help you understand how elk actually use country and how to position yourself accordingly. I have a link to those ebooks in the description. If you want hands-on application and real-time breakdowns, we have an in-person Elk Camp 2026 that is built around this same philosophy: structure, preparation, and execution in real terrain. 90% of the camp is going to be running real scenarios. You can check that out at backboneunlimited.com. And if you want ongoing access to the Team Backbone community, classroom, my full digital vault of elk resources, private discussion, and direct communication to me for planning, you can join Team Backbone at backboneunlimited.com underneath our membership tab. Everything we talk about here is connected. Preparation is not a single video, it's a system. Thanks for being here. I appreciate all of you. Until next time, train harder, hunt smarter, and never settle.